Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Shooter's Outpost Museum in Hooksett, New Hampshire, taking a look at a gun that is far from forgotten. This is the iconic, the pig, the M60. But it's a really interesting gun, and I think it's something that's well worth taking a closer look at. So, of course, the concept for the M60 began right at the end of World War II. U.S. Ordnance Department was looking at essentially all the cool German machine guns that were out there and comparing them to our kind of stodgy old Browning machine guns. And in particular, the Germans had come up with this universal machine gun concept where they had both the MG34 and the MG42 guns that could be used by a single operator, and ideally like a two-man team, off a bipod as a light machine gun, or could be mounted on a solid tripod, had extra barrels for sustained fire capability and run by a large crew with lots of ammunition and a good precise mounting on that tripod, used as a heavy machine gun. And the US didn't really have anything that would do that light machine gun role. We had the BAR, which is really more of an automatic rifle, and then we had the Browning 1919, which is sort of the last of the medium machine guns. And the closest the US came to this sort of concept in World War II was the 1919 A6, which is still an incredibly clumsy, awkward beast of a gun. It's essentially a Browning, an air-cooled 1919 with a slightly lighter barrel and a shoulder stock clutched onto it. So the US decides that we want that cool German universal machine gun thing. So their initial concept is almost literally an FG42, because hey, there's a light machine gun for you, but it's not belt fed. So let's kludge an MG42 top cover onto the side of an FG42, a second pattern FG. And there are actually pictures of this prototype from the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. That's the initial concept that will become the M60. So what happens initially, in 1946, the government gives a contract to Bridge Tool and Die Company of Philadelphia to develop this gun. And it's initially designated the T-44. In 1947, Springfield Armory steps in to participate in the project, and the gun gets redesignated the T-52. And they work through the initial design process. One of the things that is done specifically is Bridge Tool and Die decides to go with a gas cutoff and expansion system, which is an interesting concept of a gas system that, in theory, should provide nice, smooth operation and basically balance out any potentially overpressure or underpressure cartridges without sacrificing any reliability. We'll take a closer look at exactly how that works when we pull this gun apart. But it's an interesting system, and it becomes a core element of the M60. The interesting thing here is Bridge Tool and Die had essentially a contract to develop the gun, but they didn't have the capability to actually manufacture any. So Inland is brought in a couple years later to actually produce the first run of 100 of these guns for real field trials. So the project is kind of bouncing from one organization to another. When Inland picks this up, the gun gets redesignated again as the T-161, and we're talking about 1951 here. They're building the first batch of 100 guns for field trials, and there is, in fact, some competition between Inland's version and Bridge Tool and Die's version. Inland ends up winning. The first field testing of what would become the M60, which was at this point the T-161, was done at Fort Benning, Georgia, in the summer of 1953. And it had some issues. To be fair, pretty much everything has issues in its initial testing. There were two major problems that took a bit of time to resolve. One of them was the firing pin in the gun was a bit weak. And over time, the firing pin had a tendency to break. The problem was when it broke, the front half of the firing pin would stick forward and it would cause out-of-battery discharges, which is to say the firing pin would actually hit a primer and detonate a primer before the bolt was fully locked. And so a cartridge would literally explode in the breech. This is bad. It has the potential to injure the gunner and also significantly damage the gun. They were able to resolve this. It's a matter of redesigning the firing pin, making it stronger, making sure that the heat treating specs are appropriate. And they were able to do this, but it took some time. One of the other issues is they had a lot of extraction problems, and they traced this to problems with the stellite liners in the barrels. Now, they're using stellite, which is a very heat-resistant material, to increase barrel lifespan. One of the things, I should step back a moment and say the M60 was developed side by side with the M14, not associated, but at the same time period. The concept was the M14 was going to replace 4 different weapon systems in the US inventory. It was going to replace the grease gun, the submachine gun, the M1 and M2 carbines, the M1 Garand rifle, and also the BAR. It's a lot to put on one rifle, but that was the plan. And then alongside it, we're going to replace all of the Browning machine guns, which is to say the 1919 A6, the A4, and the 1917 water-cooled guns, which are still in inventory in substantial numbers. Those are all going to be replaced by the M60. So we're going to dramatically simplify all of the US Army, all the small arms logistics. Good idea in concept. And frankly, it worked out a lot better with the M60 than it did with the M14. That's an issue for another video. But what I'm getting at here is the stellite lining in the barrels. The idea was, how do we replace a water-cooled gun with an air-cooled one? Well, a couple things. We'll give it a changeable barrel. We'll give it a stellite liner to dramatically increase the effective lifespan of the barrel, and we'll have it fire from an open bolt so that we don't have a risk of cook-offs and so that air can flow through the barrel whenever it's not firing to help cool it. And these things put together will allow us to replace a water-cooled, closed bolt, by the way, Browning, with the new M60. So they have a stellite liner in the barrel. The problem is in the early testing, as the barrel heats up, the liner kind of shifts within the barrel, and what basically is happening is the liner is warping just a little bit, but it's enough to jam cartridge cases in the chamber and cause failures to extract. So between that and the firing pin issues, it's going to take them a little time to work all these problems out. Now they eventually do, and they end up formally adopting the gun in 1957. It goes into service as the M60, and it does in fact replace all of the Browning guns in US service. So let's take a look at mechanically how this thing actually works. So starting at the back of the gun, we have something that's relatively simple to operate. There aren't a lot of controls on here. This is full auto only. There is no semi-auto selector or semi-auto option. We have our charging handle on the side. It is non-reciprocating here. And one of the important details of the M60 is that in order for the gun to operate, the charging handle has to be back to open or close the top cover. Now, you can open it with the handle forward. We're going to do this properly. We're going to lock the charging handle to the rear, lock the bolt to the rear, snap the charging handle forward. Then we have a little latch here. By the way, a little tricky to shoot this left-handed. You will have that latch digging into some part of your anatomy. Now with the top cover open, you can see the bolt back here. We also have a feed tray that we can lift up out of the way. There is a spring to keep this up, but it's a little worn on this example. So the issue, you can't see it very well, but there is a track here that is spring-loaded, and that is what uses this pawl to pull cartridges, to pull the belt in through the side. And one of the things that you can do to damage an M60, or at least make it not operate properly, is to let the bolt forward and then try to be cool guy and slap the top cover shut, because it doesn't want to, because these parts do not interact properly unless the bolt is at the rear. Now, later upgrades to the M60 would alleviate this problem, but it's absolutely something to be aware of. On the other side of the gun here, we have a hanger bracket for a bag of ammunition. We also have our one safety mechanism, which is right here. Safe and fire. Pretty simple, pretty easy. The idea for ammunition supply with the M60, and there was actually a lot of thought put into this, a lot of debate over exactly how are we going to provide ammunition in the field. What they came up with was basically 100 round cardboard boxes of linked ammunition that would be shipped out already in links and already in bandoliers. So we've got 7.62 ball. This is 4 rounds of ball and then 1 round of tracer linked together with M13 links. It is worth noting the M60 does not use the same link as the Browning machine guns. It couldn't, because the Browning guns are designed to pull the cartridge back out of the belt, drop it down, and then chamber it, where the M60 takes a cue from the German machine guns, and many others, where the bolt simply pushes the round straight out of the link into the chamber. And the original Browning links don't allow that. So the M60 is designed with a new style of link, which is fairly distinctive. You'll notice where the Browning links wrap completely around the cartridge, the M60 ones do not, and that's so that they can be pushed straight out. The M60 links also have a little tab on the back that drops into the extraction groove of the cartridge. That is done to make sure that the cartridges are all spaced properly in the links. Anyway, once you had your factory supplied bandolier of ammo, you can actually take this edge of it and drop it onto this mounting bracket. Presumably it would be a little less clumsy than this once you're used to doing it. There we go. And then that will hang nicely off the gun, and you can carry it around like that. Now, apparently most guys didn't. They preferred to just have the belts loose instead of carrying them in these on the gun like this. But that's how the ammo was packaged. Moving forward a bit, we have a nice adjustable rear sight, micrometer adjustable for elevation, also windage adjustable with a very fine rear square notch. And that is used in tandem with this fixed front blade on the barrel. So hopefully all of your barrels zero to the same place, because you can only adjust the rear sight. If your barrels don't zero to the same place, you need to make a note of how each barrel needs to be adjusted differently. The gun has a nice bipod mounted on it. These legs pull down and snap up into position like so. These are on here for stability to prevent the bipod legs from bending. You've got a nice big flat pad at the bottom to keep it from sinking in. And these are adjustable for height. So if you want the bipod longer, you can extend those legs. One of the complaints that was raised about the gun from time to time was the barrel is interchangeable. It's relatively quick interchangeable, although there's no really good way to hold it, hence it was issued with an asbestos glove for barrel changing. But both the extensive gas cylinder and the bipod are mounted on the barrel itself, which means if you take the barrel out, or if you're carrying a spare barrel, you are also carrying a spare bipod and a spare gas cylinder, and that weight adds up more than, in many other designs. The gas parts and the bipod are mounted on the receiver of the gun themselves. Now, for disassembly, I've already locked the bolt open. We're going to open the top cover. We're going to, of course, confirm that the gun is empty, which it is. I am then going to let the bolt forward to relieve spring tension on it. And then we have what's called a yoke back here that locks the buttstock in place. And so I am going to pull that out. So that comes out. Then I can take the buttstock off. That's just going to slide off there. We do also have a hydraulic recoil buffer in here, which I can take out. This is actually going to be a tool for some of the further disassembly. This is basically just a shoe that goes over the end of the receiver. It does have a flip-up butt plate if you want to use that for controlling the gun. Next up, we can pull out the very long recoil spring and the recoil spring guide rod. And we can then pull the bolt assembly out of the gun. Now, here we have a little bit of an issue that one needs to be careful with, because the M60 is, the operating system is derived from the FG42, which was in turn derived from the Lewis gun. And what that means is that the bolt assembly here is under spring pressure once I take it out, and it has the potential to snap shut and cause a nasty blood blister if you're not careful. All right, so here is our op rod and bolt assembly. And if you've seen a Lewis gun or an FG42, you recognize this. Essentially, what is happening is that the op rod here is actually holding the firing pin right there. The bolt in this position with the lugs vertical is unlocked. When this goes all the way forward, the bolt is going to be held in this position with the lugs horizontal, but the op rod is held back about here, and it's held on this sear by the fire control group, which we'll pull off in a moment. And when you pull the trigger, it is in fact the op rod that will go forward, pressing the firing pin through the bolt face and firing the gun. So in order to reassemble this, you have to have it held in this tensioned position so the lugs are vertical to be installed in the gun. All right, so pulling the op rod off, we do have a roller back here to reduce friction, and we have the little claw here that's going to hold the firing pin. You would not normally disassemble the bolt as an assembly in the field because there are some small parts in here that will get lost, but I can show you the process. This rotates freely when the thing's assembled. So to disassemble it, we're going to line it up with its little cross pin right there. And I can then use the guide rod to poke that out. That is not captive or detented in any way. Once that's out, then I can unscrew the end cap here. That comes off. Then this roller assembly comes off. And then we get our firing pin spring, and basically the rear plug. Those all come out. On the front here, we have a plunger ejector and a big old extractor, and of course our two rotating locking lugs. Next up on the gun, we can take off the top cover, and we're actually going to use our hydraulic buffer to first poke out the inside pin there, and then I'm going to go to the other side and pull out this cross pin, and then the top cover comes off. Note that the top cover spring fits in that little hole and that little hole. So you have to line this up when you reassemble the gun to make sure that this spring is in both of its necessary holes there. Anyway, that gives us the feed tray here and the top cover. So you can see how similar this is to an MG42 top cover. Essentially, it is the roller lug from the bolt right here that will be tracing back and forth in this track to push the feed pawls side to side and pull a belt into the gun. To remove the barrel, we have a barrel latch here. We're going to push this detent in. There we go. Pivot that up. And then the barrel just slides out the front of the receiver. To take the handguard off, I'm going to use the recoil spring guide rod again. Let's push it in and forward. So the handguard comes off. It's just basically a heat shield and handguard there. And then lastly, we can take the fire control grip off by rotating this flat spring up like that. This is a part that would be an issue in the guns later in their service life, as this part, if this wore out, it could fall off. Once you take this pin out, you then have a cross pin here in the front of the trigger, and we get the fire control group. So this is a very simple pull trigger, sear, drops. Not much to it. And that leaves us with our receiver, which is actually an assembly of a bunch of different parts. Perhaps the most important single part is the trunnion up here that connects the receiver to the actual barrel and the gas tube. But then there are multiple elements that are riveted and welded together in order to make a complete M60 receiver. Now, one thing that I also want to show you is how the gas system on this gun actually works. You will often hear that it could be assembled backwards, and the result would be a single-shot machine gun, and you are correct. There are removable plugs at the front and rear of this gas cylinder. In practice, these were actually safety wired in place to prevent them from spinning free while being fired, which unfortunately was an issue with the gun. So we'll take that out. You can see there's little serrated teeth that in theory are supposed to prevent this from rotating out under fire, but that didn't work out so well in practice. So this front piece is just a hollow expansion chamber with a little tiny hole for venting. Inside here we have our gas piston, and note when this comes out, that's the hollow side facing forward, and that is what looks like the piston side facing backward. Here is our bolt carrier and op rod, and when the gun is being fired, these two are going to mate up like this. And if we had the piston in the gun, this is going to sit like so. Hence the hole in that to allow this op rod to go in. Our gas port is right here, and what happens with this system is that at rest, the piston is sitting here. We have one set of holes here that open up into a hollow piston with an expansion chamber up here. And when you fire, gas is going to come in here, and there's actually a groove cut in this. So gas will push into the center of this piston through all of these holes simultaneously. That will cause the piston to start moving backwards as pressure, as the gas continuing to burn, expands inside here and this expansion chamber. Now, as soon as the piston has moved a couple millimeters, it has now cut off access to the gas ports. That is the theory of the gas expansion and cutoff system. The concept here is if you have a normal cartridge, gas will vent in here, it'll start moving, and when it has just the right amount of gas, it will cut off the system here, and then continuing movement of the energy it's already got, plus the expansion of the gas that's sitting in this chamber will provide enough energy to cycle the gun. If you have an overpressure round, this will start moving faster because it's getting more gas through the gas port, and thus it will close off the gas port once it's got approximately the same amount of gas in it. So you can fire an overpressure round without actually delivering extra energy to the gas system. And in theory, if you have an underpressure round, this piston will start moving more slowly. And so it will be open longer to allow it to, again, get the necessary amount of gas to fully cycle the gun. Now, this concept is fine. It doesn't act, the theory was this would make for a smoother operating gun. It doesn't really. There's nothing bad about it, but it doesn't actually really help. The problem with the way this was executed in the M60 is that where I'm supposed to insert this piston this direction, I can also flip it around and I can insert it this direction. And frankly, if you're putting it in from the back, because you wouldn't normally disassemble any of this, but if you have to take the piston out, it looks like this is the head of the piston, and that ought to be facing the gas. Well, if you put the piston in this direction, you now have nothing lined up with your gas port, and you have a single-shot machine gun. And there's nothing to prevent you from putting this in backwards. So that was a serious design flaw in the M60. The fact that you essentially had to wire these, safety wire these to prevent them from rotating, also a design flaw in the gun. Not saying the gun didn't work as long as you did safety wire it, but really it should have been designed in such a way that it didn't need to be safety wired. In concept, the M60 was a really good solution to this missing firearm in US small arms inventory. It was the equivalent of the German universal machine gun, something that could be fired from a tripod as a precise sustained fire gun, although that didn't happen all that much, relatively speaking, but something that was also single-man portable, fired from a bipod, a lot of firepower, organic to even really the smallest infantry squad. In fact, it's interesting that there was so much optimism about the success of the M60 when it was initially being rolled out that there was actually never any modification of the existing Browning guns, the 1919s and 1917s, to 7.62 NATO. Usually something like this, when you get a brand new gun that comes out and you're adopting a new cartridge, the older guns are usually going to get some sort of upgrade program to put them in reserve and keep them around, or even if it's just in case the new gun doesn't work so well. Well, there was none of that with the M60. This looked like it was going to be a fantastic success. And what's interesting to me is, depending on who you talk to about the M60, that may or may not be what you hear. There are some people who use these guns in combat and trusted their lives to them and love them to this day. There are other people who had these things in the military who despise them without qualification. And I think part of the reason for that is kind of like the MG42, although the MG42 wasn't in service long enough for this to really become visible, the M60 is a gun with a lifespan. This is a gun that has a multi-part stamped receiver made out of essentially sheet metal, and it will, over time, wear. And when these guns were brand new in the 1960s, as long as you understood how to take care of it and were willing to deal with some of its quirks, like a gas system that you can put together wrong, like a flat spring on the side that you maybe have to watch, as long as you paid attention to that, you had a reliable gun that offered a tremendous amount of firepower in a pretty darn small and comfortable to carry package. However, turn the clock forward a couple decades and you have guns that have been used a lot, maybe in combat, but especially in training. Parts have started to wear. Spare parts supplies are starting to run low. Maybe your guns are being repaired with parts scavenged from other used guns. And all of a sudden, you start having a lot of durability-related issues. And that's when you'll see things like pistol grips falling off because the flat spring has completely lost its temper. Receivers that start to stretch. Burrs on sears that cause guns to run away. These issues, I think, tend to come up later in the gun's service life, and that will certainly impact the opinion of the gun from those who carried it. So I think that explains a lot of the sort of the dualistic nature of people's view, service veterans' view of the M60. Got it early, you probably got a pretty good gun, and it probably did exactly what you wanted it to. Get it late, maybe not so much. So that has been quite a long video on the M60. Hopefully it will serve as a very good foundation for us to look into some interesting variations and modifications and upgrades to the M60. There were a number of them, like right off the bat. The M60 C and D models were used as helicopter weaponry, either fixed or flexible mount, and they got used extensively in Vietnam. And then we have upgrade patterns of the M60 that remain in service even to this day. Denmark still actually uses the M60 E6 as its standard squad machine gun. So the guns have continued to be upgraded even though in US service they were replaced by the M240, the US version of the FN MAG in the 1990s. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.